His love of police work led to involvement in the Windsor Police Association.
It was while we were both in uniform that we both served on the executive committee of the Windsor Police Association. And I only recall ever attending one convention with Alton and those of us who were designates at that time, and that was in 1949 in Peterborough. And the president of the Ontario Police Association, and I can't remember his name, drew attention to the fact that he was both pleased and elated at the fact that for the first time in the history of the Ontario Police Association, a colored person or a black person was representing members of his force, and that person was Alton Parker from Windsor, Ontario. It drew quite a round of applause, and I'm sure Alton was very proud of this recognition. Unfortunately, during the course of people who were being introduced to speak and to greet us, one of these persons opened his remarks with what was supposed to be a funny story. And the story had an unfortunate, uncomplimentary remark about the black race. And I must say, to my surprise, and of course to the surprise of all of those who were sitting around, Alton stood up and left the auditorium. It was evident that it was also noticed from the platform, and the speaker hurriedly admitted that he was in error by having used remarks that evidently upset Alton.
Through his many years of policing, Alton Parker never failed to see his role as providing service to his community. This was often demonstrated in his dealings with young people. A young Paul Lucier and some friends were arrested by Alton Parker when they broke into a house and vandalized some of the contents.
And the thing that I remember most about him was first of all, to establish that we were the ones who were there and that we had indeed created the damage that had been done. And there was none of this trying to load more responsibility on us than there was, or to take any away. His whole approach seemed to be to point out to us that this was someone else's property. It didn't matter whose property it was not ours. And then we had to respect other people's property. And I can remember that that was his focus, was that this was someone else's property. And that's something that stayed with me through my life.
In July 1951, after a brief 9 years in uniform, Alton Parker became Canada's first black detective. In his time in uniform, he had not only served his community as a policeman, he had served his race by changing many of the attitudes and sensitivities of his fellow officers.
I worked with him one day when driving down the street. He paid attention to some children that were playing on the sidewalk, and he said, "Look, Charlie, there's our coming generation." And I replied what I thought was all right. I said, "Yeah, that's a great bunch of pickaninnies." Al? He said, "I wouldn't call them that if I were you." He said, "They're human beings." And of course we had quite a talk after that. I said, "You know, Al," I said, "I'm sorry I made that remark. I'm sorry I drew that, but," I said, "to me that's a term that is meant to be complimentary or fond. It's a fond type of remark when you speak about little colored children as pickaninnies." I never used the word pickaninnies to him again after that. Unless he brought this to your attention, you'd never know that you had been offended.
While Alton Parker quietly and almost single-handedly broke down racial intolerance in Windsor, in the turbulent 1960s, the calls for change reached a fever pitch in Selma, Alabama.
I remember one incident. when there was a protest march against the Selma incident in the States in the 60s, there was a demonstration march here in Windsor. And of course, someplace in the policing education that he got, it wasn't the right thing to do for a policeman to demonstrate against authority. And right up to time for the march, he was undecided. He was torn by his emotions. And when we lined up, my husband and I had made our decision. We were marching. Right up to the time we lined up, my father was uncertain, and then he strode in and joined us. I asked him afterwards, "Why were you there? Why did you demonstrate, Daddy?" And he said, "I could not be here."
Even in retirement, he remained vitally interested in seeing racial intolerance eliminated in police forces. When the Ontario Task Force on Race Relations and Policing came to Windsor in 1989, Alton Parker was there.
He had not asked to make a presentation, but they asked if he would remain to speak to them. They would value his input. The first question put, as I remember, was, is there racism demonstrated within the Windsor Police Force? And his answer was yes. Very clear, very concise, yes. They asked, should it be addressed? And is there, what would you suggest? He again said yes, it should be addressed. He felt that there should be intensive training, and he did feel that the Civilian Review Board situation would be a method of attaining this. When an incident is reported, that not just the investigation as it is done now through police channels, but that a Civilian Review Board be used also.
I believe that if Al had not have been involved in police work, he would still have become that community involved, that he would have found a way to bring his commitment out into the community.